The morning he moved my pension deposits into his account, he didn't even look up from his coffee. "It's just easier this way," he said. "Now that I'm home all the time, I can manage everything. You won't have to worry about any of it." I was standing at the kitchen counter in Oakville, holding a dish towel, and I remember thinking, worry about any of it, as if paying my own bills for 34 years had been some kind of burden I'd been carrying, and he was finally, generously lifting from my shoulders. His name was Gerald. We'd been married for 31 years. I was 66 years old. I had worked as an office administrator for the Halton District School Board for most of my adult life. I had my own checking account at TD since I was 22. I had an RRSP I'd contributed to every single year, even the lean ones, even the year our furnace died in January and we lived on soup for 6 weeks. I was not a woman who didn't understand money, but Gerald had retired 8 months earlier. Early retirement, he called it, though the truth was the company had offered him a package and he'd taken it without once asking me. And in those 8 months, something had shifted in our house that I still don't have the exact words for. It was like a pressure system that moves in slowly. You don't notice the weather changing until you realize you haven't been able to breathe properly for weeks. It started with the groceries. He began coming with me to Loblaws on Saturdays. At first I thought it was sweet, actually. Something to do together. We'd been ships passing for so many years, me working, him working, kids grown and gone. I thought maybe retirement would be good for us. Maybe we'd finally have time. But he started steering the cart away from things I put in. "Do we really need that?" he'd say, about a block of old cheddar I'd been buying since 1987. Or, "That's expensive for yogurt." He'd pick up the store brand and put it in instead, and I'd say nothing because it was just yogurt. It wasn't worth an argument, and I'd think, it's fine, he's just adjusting. Then, in March, he told me he thought we should consolidate our finances. He laid it out at the dinner table like a business proposal. One joint account for household expenses, which was reasonable. We'd always had that. But also, he thought my pension from OMERS and my CPP should flow into an account he managed. "I'm home all day," he said. "I can track everything, keep us on budget." "You're still working, you don't have time." I didn't agree exactly. But I didn't refuse the way I should have. I said I'd think about it. And somehow, 2 weeks later, the forms had been signed. I still don't fully understand how that happened. That's the thing about Gerald. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he just kept returning to things, calmly and reasonably, until you found yourself doing them. After that, he gave me $250 every 2 weeks. He called it my personal spending money. I was 66 years old and my husband was giving me an allowance. The first time I ran out before the 2 weeks were up. It was May. I needed a new pair of walking shoes because my old ones had worn through. Sensible Rockports, nothing extravagant. I asked him for an extra $40. He didn't say no, but he asked me to show him the shoes online first. He wanted to see if they were worth it. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at them on his laptop for a long moment. And then he said he thought I could probably get by with my gardening shoes for another season. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my hands. I thought about the 34 years I had driven myself to work every morning. The years I'd packed lunches to save money so we could put more into the mortgage. The winters I'd shoveled the walk myself because he was traveling for work. I thought about all of that and I thought, what is happening in my house? But I didn't say any of that. I went back downstairs and I said, fine. By summer, the $250 had become $200. We need to tighten up, he said. Inflation. Everything costs more. I've been going over our numbers. Our numbers, my pension, my CPP, our numbers. He was going to breakfast every Thursday morning at the place on Lakeshore with his buddy from his old job. He had joined a golf league at Glen Abbey Junior membership, he said. Very reasonable. He bought a new set of irons in July. Ping! I saw the receipt on the kitchen counter. $840. I didn't say anything about the irons. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters. I was not a weak woman. I know how that sounds. Then why did you put up with it? And I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. But coercive control, which is what our daughter's friend eventually named it for me, doesn't feel like control while it's happening. It feels like marriage. It feels like compromise. It feels like picking your battles. And by the time you realize it's not any of those things, you've been so slowly reoriented that you can't quite remember which direction you used to face. In August, he started asking where I was going. Not in an aggressive way, in a curious, conversational way. "You're heading out," he'd say when I picked up my car keys. And then, "Where to?" And then, "How long will you be?" And I'd answer, "The library. Just an hour, I need to return some books." And he'd nod, and that would be that. But the next time, same questions. And the time after. One Tuesday, I drove to the library and ran into my friend Donna from the school board, and we ended up sitting in the little cafe area for almost 2 hours just talking, the way women talk when they haven't seen each other properly in months. When I got home, Gerald was standing in the kitchen. "You were gone a long time," he said. "I ran into Donna." Donna. He said her name like he was consulting a file. "You could have texted." "Gerald, I was at the library. I didn't know where you were. I was worried." I almost apologized. That's what frightens me most, looking back. How close I came to apologizing for spending 2 hours with my friend at the public library. I didn't, that time. I said, "I'll be in the garden," and I went outside and stood among my tomato plants until my hands stopped shaking. That was when I started to understand that something had to change. I didn't tell anyone right away. That's another thing people don't understand. The silence. You don't tell people because it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. My husband asks where I'm going. So does every husband, people would say. My husband controls the money. Lots of couples do that. There's always a reason it sounds like nothing. And so you say nothing, and the silence becomes its own kind of trap. But I had a doctor's appointment in September. My annual physical with Dr. Tarr Reyes at the Oakville Clinic. And when she asked how I was doing, something in her face made me answer honestly. I don't know why. Maybe because she was a woman. Maybe because she had kind eyes. Maybe because I was just tired of the answer I'd been giving everyone else. I told her about the allowance, about being asked where I was going, about the irons and the golf league and the $200 every 2 weeks. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret, what you're describing has a name. It's called financial abuse, and it's a form of domestic violence." I think I laughed, actually. A short, uncomfortable sound. I said, "He's not violent." She said, "It doesn't have to be physical." She gave me a card for a women's resource center in Burlington. She wrote a number on the back in her own handwriting, a direct line to a counselor named Patricia. She said, "You don't have to do anything with this, but I want you to have it." I put it in the pocket of my jacket. I didn't tell Gerald about the appointment beyond everything's fine, just the usual checkup. That night I took the card out and looked at it for a long time. I called Patricia 3 days later from my cell phone, parked in the lot behind the library. Gerald didn't know I'd kept my own cell phone plan. I'd never told him because he'd never asked, and it was paid automatically from an old account I hadn't mentioned. That small omission, completely accidental, turned out to be the first thread I pulled. Patricia was calm and practical in a way I hadn't expected. She didn't treat me like a victim. She treated me like a woman with a problem to solve. She explained what coercive control looked like legally in Ontario. It had been criminalized, she told me, under amendments to the criminal code. She explained what a women's shelter could offer and what it couldn't. She asked about my financial situation with the precision of an accountant. When I told her about my OOMERFRE, Mars pension, and my CPP going into Gerald's account, she told me something I hadn't known. I had the right to redirect those payments. I would need to contact OOMEs directly and fill out a change of deposit form. I would need a personal account for them to deposit into. It would take a couple of pay periods to process, but it could be done. "He doesn't own your pension, Margaret," she said, "no matter what forms were signed." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after I hung up. The next week, I opened a new account. Not at TD, too familiar, too much chance of Gerald running into the statements somehow. I went to a Scotiabank branch in Burlington, 20 minutes from the house, a branch neither of us had any connection to. I told the young woman at the desk that I needed a basic checking account, just in my name, no mail correspondence to my home address. I gave her my friend Donna's address instead. She asked no questions. She was professional and efficient, and she handed me a debit card at the end that I tucked into the inner pocket of my purse beneath my old Shoppers Beauty Boutique rewards card. Then I started with the grocery money. Every week, Gerald gave me cash for groceries, $200, which was tight for two people in 2024, but workable if you were careful. I started being a little more careful than usual. I bought store-brand pasta instead of Barilla. I stopped buying the good olive oil. I told Gerald prices were up, which was true, they were, and I trimmed the grocery budget by $30, sometimes $40 a week. That money went into an envelope inside a box of old recipe cards at the back of the pantry cupboard, a box Gerald had never once opened in 31 years of marriage. $40 a week. It doesn't sound like much. But over 4 months, it was over $600. I also started taking stock of what was actually mine. Not what we'd built together, not the house or the shared investments. I would deal with all of that eventually, with a lawyer, properly. But the things that were mine personally. My jewelry, some of which had been my mother's, a small framed watercolor of Georgian Bay that had hung in my childhood bedroom. My great-aunt's recipe cards, which were in that same pantry box, things I would want to have with me. I was methodical about it in a way that surprised me. I had thought, when I imagined leaving, that I would be frightened and impulsive and probably do it all wrong. Instead, I felt very clear in a way I hadn't felt in months. It was like the moment your eyes adjust in a dark room and you realize you can see better than you thought. Patricia and I spoke every week. She was helping me put together a safety plan, what to take, where to go first, who to call. She'd also connected me with a legal aid clinic in Hamilton, where I'd had one conversation with a family law lawyer named Ms. Osei, who explained, gently but without softening it, what leaving a 31-year marriage in Ontario would look like. The equalization of net family property. The matrimonial home. My pension, which was a significant marital asset, and how it would be treated. None of it was simple, none of it was quick, but it was survivable. In October, I called my daughter. Claire lives in Halifax. We'd spoken on the phone regularly through all of this. Short calls, careful calls, the kind where you say, "I'm fine." Everything's fine because you don't know who might walk into the room. She had noticed something was different, I think. Claire has always been perceptive in the way that middle children often are, but I'd deflected every time she'd probed. This time I called her from the Scotiabank parking lot in Burlington, which had become my thinking spot. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Mom, how long has this been going on?" I told her the honest answer. In its current form, 8 months. In the way it always had a current. Always had a particular direction to the water, even when the surface looked still. Perhaps much longer. She cried a little. She was angry, the particular anger daughters have for mothers who've been diminished. She wanted to drive to Oakville that night, and I had to talk her down from that, explain that a scene would not help me, that I needed her to be calm and ready for when I needed her. "Tell me what to do," she said. "Just be ready," I said. "When it's time, I'll call you." November was the month I almost lost my nerve. Gerald had been, if anything, almost pleasant. He'd bought me flowers once, grocery store tulips, but still. He'd suggested we take a drive to Niagara-on-the-Lake for the day, just the two of us, the way we used to. And for one terrible week I looked at the man I'd married and thought, maybe I've misread this. Maybe I'm the one who's made it into something it isn't. I called Patricia and told her. She said, "That's very common. It's called the cycle of tension and release. The pleasant periods are part of the pattern, not evidence against it." She also reminded me that in the last 6 months I had been given an allowance like a child, had been interrogated about going to the library, and had watched my husband spend $800 on golf clubs while I was deciding whether I could afford walking shoes. I drove to Niagara-on-the-Lake. We had lunch at a nice place on the main street. Gerald was charming and funny, the way he could be when he chose to be. And I ate my soup and thought, I am leaving this man. The certainty of it settled in my chest like ballast. I had chosen a date, a Thursday in December. Gerald went to his breakfast with his friend every Thursday, reliably, 8 to 10:30. I had 2.5 hours. I had already quietly moved several boxes of my personal things to Donna's garage, a few at a time over several weeks, telling Gerald I was dropping off donations for the church sale. Donna knew everything by then. She had cried and sworn and brought me tea and told me she'd been noticing things for 2 years and hadn't known how to say anything. My RSP and my personal savings account were already separated. I had spoken with a financial advisor at the Burlington Scotia who had helped me understand exactly what I was legally entitled to do unilaterally and what would need to wait for the legal process. My pension redirection had gone through in November. OAMIRs now deposited into my Scotiabank account. 2 pay periods had passed without Gerald noticing, or if he'd noticed, he hadn't said anything yet, which told me the window was closing. The shelter Patricia had connected me with, a women's transitional housing program in Burlington, had a room ready. I would not need to stay long, Patricia thought. Claire was already looking at apartments in the area, had offered to help with first and last month's rent, and with my pension now going where it should, I was not without resources. The night before, Gerald watched hockey in the living room, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the room I had lived in for over 2 decades. The yellow walls I'd picked out. The curtains from the fabric market in Hamilton. The photographs on the refrigerator. Our kids at Christmas. Claire at her university graduation. A trip to Prince Edward Island the summer the kids were teenagers. I felt something. Of course I felt something. 31 years is not nothing. But I also thought about the $200 every 2 weeks, about the walking shoes, about standing in my own kitchen, apologizing, internally, for going to the library. I went to bed and I slept better than I had in months. Thursday morning, Gerald left at 8:10. I watched his car pull out of the driveway. Then I moved. I had a list, handwritten, which I'd memorized, and then burned in the backyard a week before. I didn't need the list. My hands were steady. I took my mother's jewelry from the top drawer of my dresser. I took the Georgian Bay watercolor off the hallway wall. I took my important documents, passport, SIN card, health card, the folder of financial papers Miss for town. Osei had advised me to secure it from the filing cabinet in the study where I'd been slowly replacing the originals with photocopies for the past 2 months. I took my winter coat and my good boots. I took the photograph of Claire and her brother from the refrigerator door. I left my keys on the kitchen counter. I carried 2 bags to my car, my own car, registered in my name, paid off 3 years ago, and I drove out of Oakville. 20 minutes later, I called Donna from the road and she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm past the QEW already." She laughed, and I laughed, and it was the first real laugh I'd had in I don't know how long. Gerald called at 11:17. I know the exact time because I watched my phone light up on the passenger seat and I very consciously chose not to answer. He called again at 11:22, 11:31, 11:39. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the Transitional Housing Center in Burlington, he had called 29 times. By the time Claire arrived that evening, she'd been in the car since I'd called her at 8:15. She'd driven 9 hours. The count was 51. Patricia met me at the door. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, "You made it." Not dramatically. Just matter-of-factly the way you say it when someone has completed a difficult and necessary thing. I stayed at the transitional house for 6 weeks. It was not the most comfortable 6 weeks of my life, but I want to say something about that place. The women there were extraordinary. Different ages, different circumstances, different levels of crisis. But there was a kitchen table where people gathered in the evenings, and there was something about sitting at that table, being an ordinary person, eating ordinary food, and talking about ordinary things that felt like medicine. I also want to say I was not naive about what came next. The legal process was long and not always gracious. Gerald hired a lawyer. There were months of difficult conversations, of forms and mediations and moments when I questioned whether any of it was worth it. There were nights in Claire's new apartment, which she'd rented specifically to be closer while things were being sorted, when I lay awake and made calculations I didn't want to be making. But the pension was mine. The court was clear about that. My OMR's pension was mine, had always been mine, and the redirection I'd made was legitimate. My RRSP contributions were my own. The matrimonial home would be subject to equalization, which was its own complicated process, but I would receive my fair share. Ms. Permess Osei, who became my full legal counsel once the situation clarified, was precise and competent, and never once made me feel foolish for having waited as long as I had. By the following spring, I had a small apartment in Burlington, 2 blocks from Lake Ontario. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, a balcony. Nothing remarkable. I bought a new couch, not the most expensive one, not the cheapest, the one I actually liked, and I put it where I wanted it, and I sat on it and I looked at the view. Gerald's calls had stopped by January. His last message, which I did not listen to for 2 weeks and then played once and deleted, was 30 seconds of silence, and then the sound of him putting down the phone. I had a physio appointment on the Tuesday after I moved in. Walking back home afterward, I stopped at a coffee shop on Brant Street and ordered a large dark roast and a butter tart. And I sat at a window table for 45 minutes reading a novel I'd borrowed from the library, and I did not tell a single person where I was. It is a strange thing what freedom feels like when you get it back. It doesn't feel the way I expected. Not like a rush, not like relief, exactly. It feels quieter than that. It feels like walking into a room and finding that the windows are open and the air is just air. Not borrowed, not rationed, not conditional. I have a friend who asked me once, some months after everything was settled, whether I regretted not leaving sooner. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I don't know how to regret something I wasn't ready to do. I left when I had the information and the support and the certainty I needed to leave safely. Some women need more time. Some women need less. What I know is that I left and that I am here, and that every Thursday morning I go where I like, and I come home when I feel like it, and nobody asks me where I've been. I am 67 years old. I have my pension, my health, my daughter, my friend Donna, and a butter tart whenever I want one. It's enough. It's more than enough. It always was. The thing I keep coming back to even now is the irons. $840, Ping brand, sitting on the kitchen counter, receipt side up, not hidden, not even tucked under a flyer. Just there in plain sight, the same week he told me $200 was plenty for groceries and walking shoes were an unnecessary expense. I walked past that receipt probably 4 times before I stopped letting myself look at it, and that avoidance, that small daily choice to not see, tells me more about where I was then than almost anything else. Gerald didn't change overnight. That's what I want people to understand. There was no single morning when he became a different person. It happened the way a room gets cold, gradually, without announcement, until one day you realize you've been sitting there shivering for a long time, and you'd somehow convinced yourself it was normal. What I did wrong for a long while was confuse endurance with virtue. I told myself that staying calm, not making a fuss, finding reasonable explanations for unreasonable things, that this was the mature way to handle a difficult marriage, that it was the kind thing, the right thing. What I understand now is that genuine decency in a relationship has to run in both directions, and when it doesn't, staying quiet isn't kindness. It's just slow erosion. Patricia said something to me in one of our early phone calls that I wrote down on the back of an envelope and kept in my coat pocket for months. She said, "Information changes what's possible. Not inspiration. Not courage. Not yet. Information first." Because I couldn't make a good decision about my own life until I actually understood what my options were. Legally, financially, practically. The moment I knew I could redirect my OMERS pension, the moment Miss Osei explained equalization to me in plain language, the moment I sat in that Scotiabank branch and a young woman handed me a debit card without a single unnecessary question. Those moments were what made everything else possible. Clarity is not a feeling, it's a discipline. It requires you to seek out the facts, even when the facts are uncomfortable, even when knowing them means you can no longer pretend you don't know. And then there's the part that no one warns you about, which is the 4 months of quiet, methodical work between the decision and the leaving. $40 from the grocery budget, week after week. Documents slowly, carefully replaced with photocopies. Boxes of my mother's things moved to Donna's garage a few at a time, wrapped in the ordinary language of church donations. None of it was dramatic. Most of it was just showing up repeatedly for a plan I'd made with myself. That consistency, choosing, again and again, to take the next small step, even on the weeks when Gerald brought home tulips, and I wondered if I was the one seeing things wrong. That's what actually got me out. Not one brave moment. Many ordinary ones. I think about the women who don't make it out, and I don't think the difference is toughness exactly. I think sometimes it's just whether anyone gave them the right information at the right moment. Dr. Ray is handing me that card. Patricia answering the phone. Ms. Osei speaking to me like an intelligent adult. Donna saying, without hesitation, "Yes, of course, bring the boxes here." Every one of those moments was a person choosing to treat someone's situation as real and worth taking seriously. Claire drove 9 hours without being asked twice. I think about what I want to pass on from all of this, and it's not a warning about husbands or money exactly. It's more that the life you're living is the only one you have, and you are allowed, required, actually, to protect it with the same care you'd give to anything that matters. Knowing what you're entitled to is not greed. Planning your own safety is not betrayal. Asking for help from people who've earned your trust is not weakness. I am 67 years old. I have a balcony 2 blocks from Lake Ontario. On Thursday mornings, I go wherever I like. That's not a small thing. That's everything.